You hear the boots first. Not marching, shuffling, dragging across cobblestones in the pre-dawn cold. Then you see them, a line of women, hands bound, heads freshly shaved, stumbling through a village square in occupied Slovenia. The air smells of wet stone and fear. A child cries from a shuttered window, quickly silenced. The woman at the front of the line, maybe 30 years old, lifts her chin despite everything. Her name was Maria, and what happened to her in the next 72 hours would define not just her fate, but the hidden war Benito Mussolini waged against thousands like her. A war fought not with bullets alone, but with systematic psychological destruction designed to break the human spirit at its core. Before we go any deeper into this story, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. It genuinely amazes me that a chapter of history this dark, from nearly a century ago, can reach people across every continent. Your curiosity matters. Italy, 1922 to 1943. Benito Mussolini didn't just build a fascist empire. He constructed an apparatus of terror that understood something most dictators miss. If you want to crush a resistance, you don't just fight the fighters. You target the mothers, the teachers, the couriers, the women who whispered defiance in kitchens and carried messages in their shoes. Because in occupied territories and even within Italy itself, women became the backbone of resistance networks. They were less suspected, more mobile, deeply connected to community life. And so Mussolini's regime developed a doctrine that was never written in military manuals but was executed with chilling consistency. Captured women would not simply be imprisoned or killed. They would be systematically humiliated, erased from public memory, and transformed into living warnings. The methods varied by region and circumstance, but the intent remained identical. Break them publicly. Make their suffering visible. Ensure that every woman watching understood the price of defiance. Maria, the woman in that Slovenian square, had been accused of hiding partisan fighters in her cellar. No trial, no evidence presented. Just a neighbor's whisper to a carabinieri officer, a midnight raid, and then the ritual. They shaved her head at dawn in front of the entire village, her 4 children forced to watch. But the head shaving wasn't the punishment. It was the announcement. What came next happened behind the walls of a converted schoolhouse where the Italian occupation forces had set up an interrogation center. Inside, the architecture of psychological torture was meticulous. For women, specifically, the regime employed tactics designed to attack identity at its most intimate levels. Forced public nudity during inspections that served no security purpose. Invasive gynecological examinations performed by unqualified soldiers, recorded in files, used as blackmail. Sleep deprivation combined with loudspeakers playing distorted recordings of their children crying. The goal was never just information. Most of these women knew nothing of military value. The goal was transformation. To turn a defiant woman into a hollow-eyed warning, returned to her village as proof that resistance consumed everything you loved about yourself. But here's what the regime didn't anticipate, and this is where the story pivots in a way that reveals something profound about human resilience. The more public the humiliation, the more it backfired. In Slovenia, in Greece, in Ethiopia, in the Italian islands used as prison colonies, something unexpected emerged. The women who survived and returned didn't inspire fear. They inspired fury. Let's go back further to where this system was born. The island of Ventetine, 50 kilometers off the Italian coast. By 1927, Mussolini had transformed it into a confino colony, a place of internal exile where political prisoners were sent without trial, sometimes for years, sometimes forever. Among the inmates were dozens of women, communists, anarchists, intellectuals, and those whose only crime was being related to someone who'd opposed the regime. The conditions were designed to erase. Windowless cells barely 6 feet across. Letters home censored so heavily they became meaningless. visitors denied, medical care withheld. But the psychological weapon was subtler: isolation within community. Prisoners could see each other, hear each other through walls, but informants were everywhere. Trust became impossible. Friendships were dangerous. The regime wanted them to survive, but to survive alone, forever suspicious, forever silenced by their own paranoia. Camilla Ravera, a woman who would later become the first female leader of the Italian Communist Party, spent years in these conditions. Her letters, smuggled out and preserved in archives, describe something worse than physical torture. She wrote about the slow theft of self, the way isolation didn't break you in one dramatic moment but eroded you grain by grain until you barely remembered who you'd been. She described watching younger women arrive full of revolutionary fire, then watching that fire dim, not because of violence, but because of the absence of witnesses. If no one hears your resistance, if no one remembers you spoke, did you resist at all? Yet Rivera also documented something the regime couldn't account for. In the cracks of that system, in whispered conversations during laundry duty, in songs hummed through walls, the women built networks of memory. They memorized each other's stories. They promised that if one got out, she'd carry the names of the others. Resistance transformed from action into preservation, the refusal to let each other be forgotten. Now, shift the geography. Ethiopia, 1936. Mussolini's forces had just completed their brutal conquest, using poison gas and aerial bombardment against a largely defenseless population. The invasion was sold to Italians as a civilizing mission, bringing Roman order to Africa. But in the occupied territories, a different project unfolded. Women suspected of any connection to Ethiopian resistance fighters faced a particular fate: forced marches. These weren't military movements. They were theater. A woman would be arrested, her crime often nothing more than being in the wrong village at the wrong time. She'd be loaded with rocks in a basket on her back, sometimes 30 or 40 pounds, then forced to walk barefoot for miles between villages. Italian soldiers would follow, ensuring she didn't rest, didn't slow. Villagers were required to watch. The woman would arrive in the next town bleeding, exhausted, broken, and the message was clear: this is Rome's power. This is what happens when you resist. But here's what the archives reveal, and what missionaries and foreign journalists occasionally manage to document despite censorship. These women often sang. Even bent under stones, feet torn, they sang. Ethiopian resistance songs, sometimes hymns, sometimes just wordless melodies. It drove their captors to fury because they couldn't silence it without killing them outright, and a dead woman couldn't serve as a walking warning. So the songs continued, and in those songs, the intended message of domination transformed into something else entirely. Witnesses remembered not the power of Rome, but the defiance that refused to be crushed. Back in occupied Yugoslavia, the methods grew more desperate as partisan resistance intensified. By 1942, entire regions were in open revolt, and women weren't just supporting the resistance anymore, they were leading combat units. The regime's response escalated. In villages where partisans operated, collective punishment became routine. But for captured women fighters or suspected couriers, a special protocol emerged: the Cartaferro. This wasn't an official term in military documents. It was what survivors called it. A heavy iron collar, locked around the neck, sometimes chained to a wall or post in a public square. The design prevented lying down, prevented turning your head, prevented any position that might bring relief. Women were left in these collars for days, sometimes weeks, in the center of towns as living monuments to submission. The physical pain was intense: swelling, muscle damage, pressure sores that often became infected. But the psychological dimension was the true weapon. Every resident had to walk past her. Children saw her. Former friends avoided eye contact. The message was about erasure of dignity, about reducing a person to an object of pity and shame. Yet even this backfired in ways the regime couldn't predict. In the town of Gorizia, a woman named Ivana was placed in the collar for allegedly carrying messages. By the third day, locals began leaving food near her, just close enough that she might reach it. By the fifth day, someone left flowers. The soldiers removed them, but more appeared. By the time they finally released her, gaunt and scarred, the entire town turned out. Not to jeer, as intended, but in silent witness. She'd become a symbol not of submission, but of what they were all enduring together. 3 months later, that town rose in revolt. The pattern repeated across occupied territories. In Greece, in Albania, in the Italian borderlands. The regime's doctrine of visible punishment kept creating martyrs instead of warnings, so they tried a different approach: disappearance. Special tribunals were established in 1943 as partisan activity reached its peak and Mussolini's grip weakened. These weren't courts in any recognizable sense. A woman would be seized, brought before 3 officers, accusations read, often with no specific details beyond anti-fascist activity, and a sentence delivered within an hour. No defense attorney. No witnesses called. No appeal. For many, the sentence was death. Execution, scheduled for dawn the following day. Why dawn? Official documents, later recovered, cited hygienic and moral necessity. The sunrise would purify the act, washing away the stain of treachery with new light. It was fascism's attempt to coat murder in ritual significance. Irma Bandiera's name appears in those records. 24 years old, a courier for the resistance in Bologna. Captured in August 1944, after the Allied invasion of Italy had already begun and Mussolini's rule had fractured into the puppet Republic of Salo. She was held for 7 days. Torture records, clinical in their detail, describe electric shocks, waterboarding, systematic beating. The goal was simple: names of other resistance members, locations of safe houses, partisan supply routes. She gave them nothing. On the 7th day, they stopped asking questions. At dawn on August 7th, they shot her in a courtyard, left her body in the street as ordered, and filed their report. But someone, probably multiple people, had been documenting her captivity. Letters describing her defiance circulated within hours. Her refusal to break became legend within days. Across northern Italy, resistance cells that had been wavering, frightened by the regime's brutality, suddenly found renewed determination. If she could endure that and give nothing, they could continue. Her executioners had tried to create a warning. They created a rallying cry instead. The final months of the regime saw this contradiction reach its peak. As Mussolini's control collapsed, violence against captured women intensified even as its strategic purpose vanished. It was no longer about suppressing resistance. It was about rage, about punishing those who'd dared to imagine his empire could fall. In April 1945, as partisan forces closed in and German allies retreated, summary executions of female prisoners accelerated. Not according to any plan, just local commanders settling scores, erasing evidence, venting fury at their own impending defeat. And yet, in those final chaotic weeks, something remarkable happened across the liberated territories. Women who'd survived confinement, forced labor, public humiliation, they didn't hide. They emerged into town squares, heads still scarred from razor cuts, bodies still bearing the marks of collars and chains, and they testified. Not in courts yet, those would come later, but in public spaces, speaking to crowds, naming names, describing what had been done to them and why. They refused the shame the regime had tried to impose. They transformed their survival into evidence. The archives that survived the regime's collapse, now scattered across Italian and international repositories, contain thousands of pages documenting this system. Medical reports on prisoners in the island colonies, interrogation logs from occupied territories, budget allocations for special detention facilities, photographs taken by Italian soldiers as trophies that instead became evidence, and letters, so many letters, smuggled out, hidden, preserved by people who understood that documentation was itself an act of resistance. One letter, written by a woman named Sophia from the Ventotene colony in 1932, captures something essential. She describes the daily humiliation, the calculated cruelty, the slow erosion of self. But she ends with a line that appears in different forms across dozens of these testimonies, from different women, different years, different places. They believed that by taking everything, they would leave us with nothing. They forgot that even nothing, shared between us, becomes something they cannot touch. Mussolini's regime fought its secret war against women because it understood that resistance lives in relationships, in the networks of trust and memory that connect people. They tried to sever those connections through isolation, humiliation, terror. They tried to make the cost of defiance so visible, so personally devastating, that silence would seem like survival. They failed because they misunderstood the nature of what they were fighting. Courage, it turns out, isn't the absence of breaking. It's the decision, made over and over in small moments, to remain human in systems designed to strip humanity away, to sing under stones, to leave flowers by a collar, to memorize names, to refuse to be ashamed of surviving. The women who endured Mussolini's prisons, his islands, his collars, his dawn executions, they didn't defeat fascism through dramatic heroism. They defeated it through the stubborn, daily, often invisible choice to remain connected to each other and to their own sense of worth. That's the story that leaves you speechless, not the cruelty itself, which is merely sad and predictable, but the resilience that transformed every attempt at erasure into a form of testimony. Maria, who we met in that Slovenian square at the beginning, survived. Her file, discovered in a basement archive in Ljubljana in 1998, contains an interrogator's note from her final day of detention. Subject remains uncooperative, recommends release as continued detention, serves no intelligence purpose, and subject has become rallying point for local sentiment. She'd been held for 9 days. They released her because keeping her was creating more resistance than her freedom would. She walked home to her village, to her children, and lived until 1989. She never spoke publicly about those 9 days. But her daughter, interviewed by researchers, said her mother would sometimes hum a particular song, wordless, rhythmic, when she worked in the garden. Years later, a historian recognized the melody from other testimonies. It was a song the women sang in the cells, a way of telling each other through the walls. "You're not alone. I'm still here. We remember." That song, passed through walls and across decades, is what defeated the silence Mussolini tried to impose. Not armies, not politics, not the inevitable tides of history, just the decision, made by women whose names we often don't know, in moments no one was meant to witness, that their humanity was not negotiable, that even when everything else was taken, that remained. And in remaining, it testified. It testifies still.